I just want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining in to the first webinar of the Introduction to Bird Monitoring series that Mushkegowuk Council Lands and Resources Department is holding in collaboration with Birds Canada and Planty Canada. So today's topic is bird monitoring techniques. For those who don't know me, my name is Hope Hill, and I am the Carving Biodiversity Project Coordinator with the Mushkegowuk Council Lands and Resources. So working to help support some bird monitoring initiatives that we are working on. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Birds Canada to get us underway.
Thanks, Hope, and thanks, Lawrence. And thank you, everyone, for joining and giving us the opportunity to share some things about bird monitoring techniques. This is going to be relatively high level with some examples throughout, and very happy to answer questions that you put in the chat or ask at the end and talk more with folks about this. So we'll jump right in here. So first off, just briefly, myself and Gregor Beck are here from Birds Canada. Birds Canada is a national bird conservation organization doing bird monitoring, citizen science, tracking of birds across the country, all with the goal of conserving birds and their habitats. And at Birds Canada, we have a new effort to improve our ability to support northern conservation and monitoring work. And so this invitation from Mushkegowuk Council to present and talk with you here is perfect opportunity for us to start that and start thinking about how we can further support northern monitoring. And so why monitor birds? I'm glad to hear we have a resident expert who will agree with me when I say birds are awesome, and that's a great reason to start monitoring birds. But also birds are really easy to see and hear and pretty readily identified. And this makes them easy to monitor. They're really excellent indicators of environmental change. And so looking at what's happening with birds can tell you about what's happening at a local landscape. It can tell you about what's happening at really broad landscapes like across the whole continent. They're closely tied to certain habitats and locations. So you can pick a bird species that you're interested in, and it can tell you a lot about a specific place or a specific habitat. And they travel really far. And so you can learn things about what's happening in parts of Canada, and studying that same bird can also tell you about what's happening in parts of South America. So it's a really cool way to connect places and think bigger picture sometimes too. And with so many different threats to biodiversity across the planet, like climate change, habitat loss, industrial activities, increased fire, all of these things are impacting birds as well as other species in their habitats. And so monitoring birds is a great way to kind of see how all of these things might be impacting the local environment. And so monitoring birds can tell us a lot. As I mentioned, it can illustrate really broad environmental impacts. Tracking populations of species over time can tell us about if a certain species is declining, what that might mean about prey availability or insects for that species, or what it might mean about specific habitats being threatened more. Monitoring birds can tell you about migration routes and areas that are really important as birds are moving north and south each year. And can tell you about where they're facing greatest threats. And one of the most important things is bird monitoring can help guide wildlife and habitat conservation at different scales. So this is a graph from a few years ago now from the State of Canada's Birds. That's a document that's put out every few years that looks at all the bird species that we have monitoring data for, and which groups of them are doing better or worse, and what that can tell us about biodiversity in Canada. And so you see some species that are doing really well, like waterfowl. So ducks and geese are generally doing quite well population-wise. And other species like birds in the grassland, shorebirds that are using places like Hudson Bay are really declining. And so this can tell us about what species we might want to focus on protecting them or their habitats and do further monitoring of. And there's a whole bunch of different monitoring techniques for birds, and I'll touch on a range of these today. And there's so many different monitoring techniques, partly because there's so many different questions that can be asked, and each monitoring technique is a little bit better at answering different questions. And so if you're asking something like, are local willow ptarmigan populations declining, then you're going to want to be doing a very different type of survey than if you're asking, why are we seeing fewer shorebirds in this section of coast? So local populations of a species, you might be thinking about doing repeated surveys in an area or using ARUs that a future webinar will talk about. Or if you're talking about shorebirds, it might be looking at broad scale migration patterns or some kind of tracking system. And so the techniques I'm going to talk about today include standardized monitoring, so things like point counts and area-based surveys, citizen science, which often has a lot of overlap in terms of protocols with standardized monitoring, but often simplified in ways that more people are able to do it. You don't have to be a trained biologist necessarily to do these types of surveys. Some different tracking techniques, so actually putting devices on birds and figuring out where they go specifically. Remote sensing, I'll just touch on briefly because that's another webinar topic next week. And banding and migration stations and what those can tell you about bird numbers and movements. And I wanted to show you this interesting graphic because it touches on a bunch of these and a few that I'm not going to talk about today that are kind of more technical ways of understanding bird movements and bird populations. And so this just shows the many different tools that are out there and how they can kind of tell you about where birds are coming from, where they're moving to, things like isotope analysis. And so this is looking at a feather of a bird, and it can tell you what that bird was eating and where it was eating it a few months ago. Things like looking at genetic analysis, genetic markers. So if you have, again, a feather sample or a blood sample from a bird, you can tell what population it came from. And the things I'll talk about more today, like radio telemetry and tracking where a bird actually moved, or citizen science, talking about where birds have been seen and putting that together at a big scale to see where birds are moving. So first off, go through some ideas about standardized monitoring and citizen science. And so there's a lot of monitoring programs that follow very specific protocols. And some of the things that these almost always have in common are consistent surveying and timing. And so across a year, so repeated surveys across a year, same time of day, same part of the breeding season, that kind of thing helps make it so that you can compare the data between years better and understand how things might be changing. Seasonal focuses, depending on the goal, whether you're looking at spring migration and you want to be out surveying right now, or you're interested in what birds are breeding in a place and you might focus on mid-June. Timing of the surveys is really important. A lot of bird surveys are done really early in the morning because that's when songbirds are singing. But if you're interested in things like water birds, you might be basing your survey purely around the tide timing and trying to do surveys at high tides. You can actually see the birds as they're pushed closer to the shore. And a lot of surveys, it's useful if habitats focused or at least recorded, so that can be controlled for. And then there's some kind of broader programs that I'll mention a bit later briefly as well that have a bit less of a standardized protocol, but if they collect enough data, then you can still do really important things with them, like eBird and Project Feeder Watch. So one of the most common techniques with standardized monitoring is point counts and kind of area-based surveys. And so these can tell you things like, are species numbers changing in a certain wetland, for example. So you're doing repeated surveys at the wetland location, or are songbird arrival times changing near our community? And so doing kind of a series of surveys through the spring each year and telling when different species are arriving based on that. Or what species use a certain section of the coast the most, and why is this section of coast of interest for that species? And so doing repeated surveys along the coast. And so point counts are really nice, relatively simple once you know the birds that you're trying to see, way to survey. So for a point count, generally you stand at a point, and this diagram is what's often used to record the data. You stand at a point and you kind of imagine some circles around you, and you're trying to record the birds, sometimes at unlimited distances and sometimes within certain distance bands, and you're writing down what you see. These surveys are often really short, so 3, 5, maybe 10 minutes long, and you're just standing and recording all the species you can see and hear. Sometimes you're recording things like no bugs in this example here as well. But it's a great way to have kind of standardized data. You mostly listening for song, but you're also looking for birds. And when the bird is detected, helps tell you a bit more about how often it's singing and different things like that. And you can get pretty accurate counts of the species and the numbers of different individuals that you're seeing during this time, especially as you're using this diagram to help record where you're hearing each bird through the point count. An example of a protocol that Birds Canada runs and it's both a citizen science program, but also done by biologists, is the marsh monitoring program. And so this uses point counts in marsh ecosystems. They're done twice a year at the same series of points along a route through a wetland. And they're mostly focused on trying to detect secretive marsh species. So things like Sora or Virginia rail, species that kind of hide in cattails a lot, are pretty hard to see. But if you're out there early in the morning, they call. And if you play their calls, then they're more likely to call back. And so that is used in this survey as well. And so these are repeated every year to see trends in these species and get more data on them generally about what habitat they use and how often they're calling. And so that's some neat results from that in the region I'm in. I'm in New Brunswick. Came out recently and showed kind of which species are more associated with different kinds of wetlands. And so it's useful information that takes a dedicated survey like this to figure out. Another survey type is area-based surveys. And so one example is this coastal waterbird survey that's done in British Columbia, where certain sections of the coast are kind of mapped out like this, and a surveyor goes out once a month through the winter when there's huge concentrations of birds on the coast and scans this section of coast and tries to see and count all the species that they're able to in that section of coast. And so they're doing this at high tide, again, as I mentioned, so that birds are pushed closer to the coast. They're repeating it monthly. And after 10 plus years of doing this, we have really, really cool results showing that species like this red-throated loon is declining in parts of the BC coast. And we can start to think about more, what does that mean? What does that tell us about the ecosystem? What does it tell us about the prey that red-throated loon might be eating? And because there's a bunch of these different survey areas along the coast, it also tells us what sections of the coastal habitat seem to still be the best for birds versus what sections seem to be having challenges and declining quality of habitat. And so a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of the standardized monitoring can happen through citizen science or kind of public engagement in these monitoring protocols. And so I know a future webinar will talk about the Breeding Bird Atlas. Another national program or international program is the Breeding Bird Survey, where people do 50 point counts in the morning 3 minutes long each, and they're doing these across the country at a whole bunch of different sections of the kind of roadside surveys. And so this is a really useful survey, and it's what a lot of the results for kind of national or international bird declines are based on, because it's really well standardized and you get a lot of data each year. And then I think this is a really great example of a survey that is a bit less rigorous in terms of being out at the exact time or doing detailed counts of a bunch of different species at once. So the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, they're interested in just a single species, but loons can tell us a lot about the whole health of the lake ecosystem. So it's a really interesting species to study. And it can be done by biologists or by anyone that has a cottage on a lake or lives on a lake or regularly spends time at a lake. And so for this survey, they're not asking you to go out on a specific day. You're not trying to do a 5-minute count and see how many loons you can count, but you're surveying throughout each month. As many times as you happen to get out, you're looking for counts of adult loons that you saw on your lake. You're looking for how many pairs of loons you saw. And then as you're able to find them, seeing nests or seeing birds kind of displaying behaviors that indicate nests, and recording information on how many pairs there were, did they have young come from their nest, and that kind of more general information that can be seen by a kayaker just boating around on a lake. And once you do this across enough lakes, or through enough years, you get information on how loons are doing and whether they're breeding as frequently, successfully raising as many chicks, that kind of thing. And it's really useful, but it also engages a bunch of people and doesn't take a lot of training to be involved in. And then one example of kind of the biggest way you can do this general reporting of birds and have it be really useful for population monitoring is eBird. I use eBird a lot and could talk lots about the many benefits and interesting things with eBird, and I'm happy to more if people want. But this is a global data set where anytime you're out looking at birds or listening for birds, you can report what you see, and it goes into this data set that can be used by scientists. And so it doesn't tend to be as good a tool for very specific or local questions, but it's a really great tool to engage kind of anyone in learning about and submitting observations of birds. And so it's both a great introductory tool and a great tool for trained biologists. And then many of you may know more about this app than me, but I wanted to just share it here as well. Another example of a way to collect data that's not necessarily protocol specific, but can be really useful and tell you things about migration timing or and kind of engage more people in birds. And so the CQ app I know has aspects where you can talk about goose harvest or talk about goose migration and report sightings of kind of early goose arrival in different locations. And so this kind of app that helps connect people, but also helps us understand when geese are moving is really interesting. And so just wanted to share here that a lot of these protocols that I've mentioned and different ways of doing kind of in-person monitoring of birds, Birds Canada has a huge range of protocols that we use for different species in different parts of the country. And a lot of these are pretty adaptable. So if there's questions that folks have at a community level or at a broader level that they think they could answer with in-person monitoring, we're pretty readily able to adapt some of these protocols and help set them up that would help answer these questions. And we do have app-based data entries, so it can all be entered on a phone, which makes it a lot easier to handle, and a database that all of the data that's collected can be managed by the user, so as public or not public as folks want. And so both Gregor and I and other staff at Birds Canada are ready and excited to help support any Indigenous-led efforts at monitoring programs or using some of this data. So please reach out. And so I'll switch focus from kind of this in-person counting and monitoring of birds to some of the techniques out there for tracking birds. There's a range of reasons why you might want to track a bird by putting a tag on it. Often they're about knowing where a species goes on migration, and so just learning more about flight paths of these birds and connecting breeding grounds to non-breeding grounds, that kind of information. It can be really important to help protect species to understand the habitat use of a species while they're on migration and in both breeding and non-breeding grounds. So learning more about these kind of detailed movements about what habitat they're liking and where they're moving can help us protect those species. And similar to that, determining locations of high importance for species, both individual species or when you combine some of these tracking programs for multiple species. And so if there's spots that really stand out as really high importance for migrating shorebirds, for example, then it's can help conserve that area. And then there's also some really interesting things you can do about learning about avoidance of threats through migration. So are they avoiding cities and city lights? Does industrial land change where they migrate? How do fires and smoke movement affect where they might be moving? And so those are some of the really cool questions that sometimes you can try to get at from a study, and sometimes incidentally you find out about through a study. And so there's a few different technologies that can be used to track birds and other small wildlife. Birds Canada is heavily involved or leads MODIS, and so this is one of the main radio telemetry tracking tools. And so this is where a small tag is put on a bird, and this tag is sending signals occasionally, and when they're picked up by a receiving station, we know about where that tag was detected. And so this is a pretty cost-effective way to track birds and can be used both locally and with long-distance movements based on where you have these receivers set up. Satellite tracking is slightly bigger, so you can't put this on small warblers, but really high precision, and you get a lot more data back from satellite tracking studies, but also quite a bit more costly per bird you want to track. And then geolocator tracking uses sunlight, and so sunrise, sunset times to estimate where the bird is based on that. It's more middle of the road price-wise. You can get really good full life cycle data because if it goes to the southern tip of South America in some really remote area, you can still be getting data. But it's lower accuracy, and you have to catch that bird again in order to take that tag off and find out where it went. And so briefly, the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System is an international collaborative research network that uses a coordinated automated radio telemetry array to track the movement and behavior of small flying animals. So it's used for bats, it can be used for monarch butterflies and kind of larger butterflies and dragonflies even. So researchers fit small radio transmitters onto animals, and then there's signals detected by receivers scattered across the landscape. And MODIS is the central hub for detection data for more than 750 receiving stations now. And so you can see this map of where there are existing receiver stations. And all of this data includes location on where tags were put on, where each tag was detected, species, dates of all these things. And then data from across the network is provided back to researchers, and kind of a simplified version is available to the public in some cases. And so putting up a MODIS tower means that if you're kind of the owner of that MODIS tower, you'll be able to see what species are detected at your tower. And if you put a tag on a bird, then you're able to see all of the towers that tag is detected from. And so it's a way to kind of, as you build your own project, it supports other researchers as well because it builds into this broader array. And so one of the really, really cool examples that Gregor and I love to share from MODIS is a few years ago, or I guess just last year. There's a red knot that had a MODIS tag on it and was doing its migration and did a strong U-turn at some point while migrating, corresponding with what we assume is smoke and headwinds from fires. And so did this strong migration and flew all the way back down to its, sorry, I was pointing to the wrong screen here, flying north, ran into smoke likely, and returned all the way back down to the coast to kind of refuel probably from migration, and then tried again and flew back north. And so being able to see things like that and tie them to large things like fires and smoke movement is really cool and tells us a lot, even if it's just a single individual that we get that data from. And so on this bird, you can see a MODIS antenna sticking out. And so this is the part that's actually sending the signal and the little tag that helps us identify the bird. Birds Canada has been doing some work in Labrador. We were invited by the Nunavut government to collaborate on a project installing MODIS receivers. Within a week of installing one of the receivers, a horned lark was picked up on one of them that had been tagged further south. And so kind of right away, they're able to see some results. And the approach there has been to set up some towers and then think about projects and what species they might want to tag and learn more about using these towers. So it's a easy way for the community to kind of care for and set up a tower and see data from that tower. And then we can help think about ways to support further projects from that. So Lucas in the left in this photo is one of our MODIS technicians that's done a lot of this great work and is really happy to help engage and think about things as that is of interest. So satellite tracking, as you can see, it's a bit larger of a tag on a bird, but you get this kind of really fine scale data of where they're moving. So this is an example of a long-billed curlew in British Columbia. And we have a bunch of individuals and you can see where they moved down for migration, see where each individual spent the winter, kind of moving through different valleys in California, and then what routes they took back north to their breeding grounds in Southeast British Columbia. And so this is the kind of result you could get from other technologies, but if you want really fine scale, satellite tracking is the way to do that. Some of these birds, we were able to tell that they preferred certain field crop types in the winter that they were spending more time on. And so that kind of result is really interesting and requires the higher precision of satellite tracking. And then geolocators are similar MODIS tags, quite small. And now even many MODIS tags are much smaller than this geolocator pictured here. Geolocators in general are kind of being used less and less because their precision isn't great and it does require recapturing the bird at some point to get that tag back off to get any data. And with these other technologies, you can attach the tag to the bird in a way that it will fall off after a certain amount of time. So you know the bird's not going to be stuck with a tag on it, and you don't need to get that tag back to get the data still. So it's generally a more used way, but still plenty of applications for geolocators if you want really long distance or kind of year-round data. This is my only slide on ARUs. I just wanted to mention a few things in comparison to some of these other techniques. So automated autonomous recording units can answer a lot of similar questions to in-person monitoring with a few caveats. They're really good at things like arrival timing, at species presence. But if you want to have kind of accurate species counts at areas, especially of silent species or species that might be calling in large numbers that are really hard to tell, like separate individuals when you're looking at recordings, then doing in-person data is important. And so often these technologies are paired, ARUs and in-person point counts, because you get slightly different benefits from each. And then the other piece is that putting out ARUs can collect a ton of data. And so it takes quite a bit of work after the fact to analyze this data. And so making sure there's plans for that. And we're hoping at Birds Canada to kind of build some capacity or have some ways to support the analysis of this further, because it's a growing need as we talk to people using ARUs, that you can collect all this data, but to actually get the information you want back from it takes a lot of extra work. And so then I'll talk a bit about banding stations or migration stations. These are kind of some of the earliest ways that people were monitoring birds in North America. So a station where you set up mist nets, so fine nets that birds fly into, are captured just for a few minutes, and then someone pulls them out of the net and puts tags on their legs. The idea here is that you can look at population trends, both from recaptures of these same birds, or just by the number of each individual or each species that you're getting at a banding station in a migration period. You can collect a lot of demographic and physiological information, so it's a great way to learn more about are birds fattening up when they're at this banding station, or are they really skinny and they've really been flying a long way? That kind of information. And timing and other aspects of migration ecology are a key part of these. So which species are arriving first? How long are species spending in an area? So how often maybe are you recapturing that same bird, or seeing a lot of yellow warblers at the station before they kind of move on and the next species is coming through? And a lot of these stations are paired with doing point counts. So they're not just banding there, but they're also doing a lot of these standardized monitoring protocols as a way to collect further data at the same station. And so there's a whole range of migration monitoring stations that exist already across Canada as part of the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. And so there's lots of expertise at Birds Canada and across Canada in this area. And also, if there are folks really interested in learning how to band and handle birds, then there's always opportunities at some of these local stations, and we're hoping to have some opportunities at Birds Canada. So if there's specific projects that would involve banding and tagging birds, please feel free to reach out and I can help try to connect you with someone that can help with the training aspects of this as well. And so there's all these different techniques to collect data on birds, but what can this monitoring data actually support? And so there's a bunch of kind of local questions that these approaches can answer. So population changes or timing of migration changes at a local level, responses to wildfires. If you happen to have monitoring data at a place and then a fire comes through, and you can keep doing monitoring data at that place, you can get some really interesting results on what species come back. And that's how we know a lot of things about species and their use of fire-burned areas. And same kind of questions with climate and industry and any unforeseen threats. As we have this data existing, anything that might happen in the future, we can be a bit more prepared for understanding the impacts of it. And yeah. And then also conservation areas benefit a lot from monitoring data. So planning where we need conservation areas, planning boundaries of conservation areas based on where we have high populations of certain species or more threatened species, whatever the need might be. And once we have conservation areas, understanding if they're effective takes monitoring as well. And so this could be a range of different kind of conservation techniques like Indigenous protected and conserved areas. I know Mushkegowuk Council is working closely on the National Marine Conservation Area, and so understanding boundaries on that and supporting that with monitoring data. and key biodiversity areas as well. So just some examples of how some of these monitoring programs, mostly ones that I've mentioned in this presentation already, could be used. So here, monitoring data can kind of reveal hotspots of bird use across years. And so this is coast of British Columbia, and looking at just scoter population or scoter counts throughout years. And these darker red areas of the coast are where there's really high concentrations of scoters through the winter. And so by looking at that, and we know a lot of scoter populations are declining in the Salish Sea here. And so we can tell that these areas are of really high importance across years, and so repeated across years for scoters. And so that helps guide conservation efforts for scoters, for those habitats, or for the benthic invertebrates that the scoters are eating. And some of the same data from that slide was also used to understand waterbird populations more generally in the Salish Sea versus the northern coast of British Columbia. And based on the results, we surmised that a combination of industry and overfishing, warmer water temperatures in the Salish Sea, and likely increased boat traffic have made it so that Salish Sea wintering bird populations have declined greatly, but northern coast and kind of more remote sections of the coast where there's less of this disturbance are doing better. And so it's after years of monitoring, kind of standardized monitoring, and comparing different areas that we were able to tell what was going on in the Salish Sea. So the example of the National Marine Conservation Areas, this is a map from the To Which Is Where I Belong report that shows the proposed boundary of the National Marine Conservation Area. And so having both offshore data, but also inland data to support having a boundary that protects the coast could be really useful. And so thinking of species of interest or areas of interest to study, this monitoring data could help bring that 20-kilometer boundary inland. An example of tracking data actually being used to benefit a conservation area. This is a national marine national wildlife area in the coast of British Columbia. There's a Triangle Island here that has a large population of seabirds that breed on it. And so people were putting tracking devices on some of these breeding seabirds and seeing these long foraging trips that they're making hundreds of kilometers from the island to catch food and bring back to their chicks on the nest. And so based on these kind of tracking studies, when they planned the National Marine Wildlife Area boundaries, they were able to plan it further offshore than they otherwise could have, and make sure to include some of these important sections of coast or of ocean shelf where these birds are going to forage. And so the tracking data helps reveal these areas of importance. And so that's now captured as part of the protected area. Key biodiversity areas are not a legal protection mechanism, but a recognition of biodiversity importance for an area. And so because they're an internationally standardized way of recognizing importance for biodiversity, it's just an additional way to kind of leverage conservation of an area. And so if you can have an area that's designated as a key biodiversity area, then that kind of international recognition could help support conservation efforts. And these key biodiversity areas are based on things like high counts of certain species, or high diversity of species in an area. So migrating shorebirds or really high numbers of red knots along a section of coast, that kind of thing, are how key biodiversity areas are designated. And so, yeah, I touched on a whole range of monitoring techniques that can be used based on the questions of interest. And a lot of conservation efforts continue to rely on both long-term and new studies and new monitoring techniques telling us where to protect habitat and where this protection is working has been a really key thing that we're conservation folks are trying to do more and more. And yeah, Gregor and I and BirdScan are really happy to have further conversations if there's any specific projects or monitoring techniques that folks are interested in more after today. But happy to answer some questions.
Graham, I'll just jump in. Thank you so much for presenting all of those, a whole suite of monitoring techniques. I'm familiar with most of them, but it just really highlighted how many different sorts of tools and techniques are out there. And as you said, each one can answer different questions. And sometimes if you design them locally, they can answer really important questions. And if you put different types of surveys together, maybe it's a local or regional tool, and you put that into the context of what's happening in the bigger region across the boreal or across a province, that's really helpful. I noticed Lawrence or maybe it was Job in the chat was talking about how there was noticing some birds that are now absent, some that are coming earlier or later or not at all. There are some of those survey types that you mentioned that really kind of address that, so thank you. And if it seems overwhelming, all these different types, Graham and I are happy to follow up. And we're sort of expanding our programs and collaborations. So sort of, if nothing else, this could be just a bit of an introduction to say, feel free to get in touch with us, because we like to sort of, the work we're doing is kind of not our Birds Canada projects. We have these tools, but we'd actually like to support projects and interests coming from communities, especially. And I will sort of mention some upcoming job opportunities with Birds Canada as well. I'll put something in the chat before we sign off. Hope remind me to do that before we sign off.
Yeah, thank you, Graham, for your presentation, and Gregor for your input. Also, if you could put your contact information in the chat, that'd be great for people to follow up. But now we are ready to answer any questions, hear any comments anyone has. So feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself. I see that we already have one question in the chat, so I'll just read it out loud. The first question is, I'm currently working on an Indigenous-led biodiversity project in which we are developing a baseline to compare future restoration conservation outcomes against looks like that seconds got cut off a little earlier, but they were hoping to tap into the nature counts data. Is there someone I can reach out to regarding aiding this? Are there any tutorials online?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to dig up some tutorials to send you right away, but very happy to answer questions directly as well. I put my email in the chat, and if you want to reach out, I'm happy to have a meeting and just help walk through nature counts data downloads and things. Yeah, that's super.
Thank you for that. And so we have another question in the chat to follow up on what was mentioned by Alex. I wonder if there's any educational materials for more novice birders that could be expanded on.
Yeah. Again, I can put a link in the chat. Birds Canada website has a range of different ID guides or tools to identify kind of common birds in your area and that kind of thing. But also if there's specific educational materials you're interested in, please reach out, and I'm happy to pull together a set of resources.
Great, thank you. And Sharon from Planty Canada, I just wanted to let everybody know that in our third webinar of the series, which will be on June 13th, they'll be covering more on nature counts and resources for the Ontario Bird Breeding Atlas. So stay tuned for that. It'll be at the same time and same link to be able to join the webinar. And then Gregor, as mentioned, posted some potential job opportunities with Canada, Birds Canada. So feel free to share within your networks. If we have any interest birders or people interested in bird monitoring.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to add to, I know Sam has his hand up too, so I'll be quick. Just to add to, I guess, the overall mix. Yeah, so I work for Mushkegowuk Council. I work with Hope. I'm the research manager here. And yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, we are encouraging, developing, and want to provide support for community-based monitoring in the Mushkegowuk First Nations, and then help with really any First Nations that are interested in our region locally. Plenty Canada is definitely already working with many First Nations in Northern Ontario to enhance bird monitoring activities. So one of the things that we'll be doing, this is part of, I guess, starting off, is to visit the First Nations in the Mushkegowuk territory to talk again, but in person, about the things we just heard about, but also introduce some of those tools that we've been able to purchase through different grants with Plenty Canada and the Canadian Wildlife Service. So including those ARUs, so they're always autonomous recording devices. I always get that acronym wrong. And also trail cameras, so other ways as well to help communities kind of start monitoring species that they're interested in. So that we'll be following up with that in person over the next month or so. And we actually already started with Chapleau Cree. That's when we met Alex. So yeah, so we're all pretty excited about connecting with Birds Canada and Plenty Canada, and yeah, really keen to help each community start doing their own monitoring. Thanks.
Nikki, so great. I mean, just the sharing of tips and techniques, what's worked, what's not worked, you know, what helps keep bears from knocking over those Motus towers. These are some of the things that we've been investigating over the last few years, including in the Arctic, where it's not just black bears, but I know Russ Weber, who's on the call, and just mentioned things like, you know, ARUs with 2 external mics, you know, being better. Russ could jump in anyway, as opposed to internal mics. But I think Terry's got questions. So just these sorts of tools and techniques to share. This is such a wonderful forum.
Okay, great. Sam, you had a question?
I just have a few comments and a little story, I guess. I have all kinds of equipment to set up this summer. I got these. They're trail cameras. I got 5 of them. I got 6 of these, brand new. This came in yesterday. They're really high-end equipment, but I think one of my best equipment is this one. It's about the $2,500 microphone. It's really, really good, and I really recommend these kind of equipment. And I also have a Zoom H5, which I think is very, very good. And I did recording maybe 6-7 years ago, and they're really high quality. I really recommend buying these kind of equipment or somehow getting them. And I've been involved. My father was he enjoys bird watching, and I kind of grew up with it. And I remember seeing that report about the declining populations of the shorebirds by 40%. And we're trying to protect birds with our conservation um, indigenous protected areas too. And I'm really interested in that. So when I saw that report a while ago, in a couple of years, and I had saved up money, and I went to Argentina and to find out how they're protecting their birds there. They do have protected areas, but it's not really protection. It's just basically not to hunt them, but they're still trampling over where they feed. And so I got in touch with birding over there, the organizations. We met, and I'm going to try to fundraise to get them up here so they can get their information back, because the government's not really they don't really promote what they preach over there. So I think that they really need our help, and they are really interested in protecting the birds, because a lot of the birding groups, the members too, they didn't even know that the birds are born here and they go all the way there. And they've seen some birds that are from up here that are down there. And I'm making a video about it, but I still got to take some videos from here this coming summer. So with that, I think that I can just, I guess, I think everybody knows what kind of equipment we need, but the equipment I've been using certainly has done me well, especially with the song meter. It's got 6 new ones this year, and I'll set them up probably next week. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I really like that point, Sammy, about connecting with people in South America. And that's really cool that you went there and kind of learned about what they're doing for the birds. And I think those kind of connections are really important. Birds Canada's been trying to do more of that as well. Think about what are species doing and how can we better help in South America as well, so that we can help the birds that breed in Canada. And so as you think about ways you want to do that more, please feel free to ask if we can help. We'd be really happy to help support that kind of connection and dialogue across North and South America.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention we're setting up a MODIS tower too to track some other bird species. So we're getting a little busy doing a little bit of different things here and there.
Sammy, sorry, I know there's another question, but where is that location for the MODIS tower?
It's going to be located at where I have my research station, close to the bay.
Okay.
Only about 400 feet from Hudson Bay, and the river is 400 feet on the other side. So it's very good location for seabirds and all kinds of birds.
Well, let's stay in touch. We'll make sure we've got your contacts. You're doing a lot of really interesting things.
Great. And Deputy Chief Terry Magawabing has a question.
Yeah, good afternoon now. Deputy Chief Terry Matadawabin, Fort Albany First Nation is the west coast of James Bay. We're a remote First Nation community. And I just want to say a few comments. I'm really thankful for this call, for the people that set it up and that are participating. Thank you. And the presentation was really well put together. And maybe in the future we can translate it into Cree for the video, because we have about 65 elders in our community that are wealth of on the land knowledge. And it'd be nice to transcribe that whole presentation to Cree. I think that would be a knockout. I just want to talk about 4 things. Our community, Fort Albany, have initiated on the land initiatives, we call it. And the Cree term is Betagaban. And so we've successfully designated camps on the shores of James Bay and on the Albany River system as far as 200 miles. When we activate these designated camps, they are in the spring and fall. So we have, we call them camp bosses. Each camp boss leads their families or leads their designated camp to get supported by helicopters to fly in all their essential goods and supplies. And we support our frontline harvesting designated camps because they are stewards of the land. And when they feel that support, they give us report back wealth and knowledge what's happening out there. And then with the elders, they even participate. They actually go on some of the helicopter rides and just see how the land is changing. They're very honored to participate on those harvesting seasons, spring and fall. One of the things I like to share to the group is climate change. This is the first time the Albany River, the 200-mile stretch that we know, this is the first time we landed the helicopter on the Albany River and shut it down with no water. Last year was the first time our moose hunters could not use boats to go upriver. I have the video. We shared it with the government about how serious the drought of our river was. I was really shocked myself to be on a helicopter to land on the Albany River and just see ponds of water around us, not a full-scale flow. And I have that footage and that still photo of me standing in the middle of the Albany River where it's supposed to be a running channel. We had a serious fire last year, and that happened across Canada from BC to Manitoba to Ontario to the East Coast. And that severely impacted our area, over 800 hectares. And it may not seem a lot, but where it happened was a very concentrated area of species. And it's very sad to see that all gone. Like when you fly through the area, you walk through, and it's very emotional for some people to look at because they invested their time and family there. So I think
Oh, sorry, you muted yourself.
they're sorry. And so they're still having those conversations today, like as if it happened yesterday, with the way the river is and the way that fire changed our way of life. My final comment is I appreciate Vicky's comment about going to the communities. I think that's very welcome here in Fort Albany. I propose that we coordinate with all this intelligent thinking here to have a forum in Fort Albany. We'll be happy to host that. We can work out the details with Mushkegowuk, but I think it's important that you hear from the people on the land themselves and they get testimonies from them. Because the more we share with them, the stronger and wealth knowledge that we'll get together. And I'm really happy what Sam is doing up in Hudson Bay. He's been the ambassador for many, many years. And the best thing we can do is continue to carry their stories stronger, and we can all link together and really make progress in how to monitor and be responsible. We have to be responsible with what's happening, but let our communities know what's going on out there. It's doing good.
Thank you, Deputy Chief, for those comments. Me and Vicky will definitely reach out to coordinate. And yeah, we are recording these webinars to be able to share. So translation is something on our list to be able to share. So thank you for that. We will end the webinar now. I will be putting my contact information as well in the chat for anyone who wants to reach out. Our next webinar will be next week, same time, Thursday, June 6th, and we will be talking about monitoring with Saw Meter Mini 2 recorders specifically. So hope you can join us for that as well. But otherwise, we thank you for joining us today. Feel free to reach out to any of us for further support, resources, and enjoy your lunch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
everyone.
everyone.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Thanks, everyone.